Today I want to talk about this episode with Martha and Mary, and I want to look at it in three different ways or with three different levels of interpretation. And the first two levels are I'm pretty sure of, and the third level I'm not as sure of, but I think there's something there. I think it might be one of those things that I was speaking of at the beginning, that I don't understand the context well enough to know what the message is or what the lesson is, but there's something there and I want to grapple with it and see if we can find something. So the first level of interpretation that I'm familiar with Martha and Mary, in religious circles we talk about Martha and Mary as representing the busyness of doing and action, sort of an action-oriented response to the gospel, a doing things response, versus Mary with her contemplative response to Jesus, sitting and listening to Jesus. Martha comes out and is upset because she's so busy. And Mary's not helping, and don't you care that she's not helping? Tell her to do what she's supposed to do. And Jesus commends Mary for her contemplative response. And so we've taken this as an indication that there's the need for both contemplation and works as we respond to the Word of God. And I think that's a valid way of looking at this. I've certainly heard good teachings around the need for both of those things. The second level of interpretation of this story that I want to look at is the cultural level. And once again, I referred to another commentary written by this priest. Her name is Naveen Saras, and she's a Palestinian Christian, and she was born in Bethlehem, grew up there in Bethlehem, the one in the Middle East, not the one in Pennsylvania. That's an important distinction, right? And so she's a Palestinian Christian, and she's a Lutheran minister, and she writes commentaries. And she wrote a commentary on this passage where she talked about culturally what was going on in that scene. And she pointed out first that this house belongs to Martha. It's not Lazarus's house that Martha is staying in. It's her home, okay? And Lazarus and Mary and everyone else is there. So she is the proprietor of the matriarch of the house. And there is a holiness to hospitality. There is a sacredness to the obligation to provide hospitality when you invite someone into your house. And it's more than just being nice to strangers. When you have someone into your house and they share food at your table, you are inviting them to participate in that sacred connection that we share, which is family, and that we share with God. And so, and all of that is what is considered to be the expectation of hospitality from a home and from someone who invites you, from a host who invites you into their home. It's hard to appreciate that from a Western perspective. It's hard to appreciate the depth with which that shapes people. I remember when I was in college, the apartment next door had a couple of Persian fellows living there, and they were friends of mine. One of them I was going to UC Berkeley, and one of them was a student there, and the other one was his brother, and they lived together in this apartment. And if I went into their apartment, I was guaranteed to be given tea and food and it was almost embarrassing. I got to where I was like, I wanted to make sure that they were ready for me before I would knock on their door. And it was fun. They were really neat guys. I liked hanging out with them. Their cat liked our cat, They were good neighbors. And it was just that sense of the obligation to hospitality was just so fundamental to their character. So that is one of the things that's going on when Jesus and the disciples come into Martha's house and Martha's sister Mary is sitting there. The other thing that's going on, though, is that Jesus is the rabbi, the teacher, okay? And so Jesus has called people to follow him and to learn from him. And there's a tradition that goes along with that when someone becomes a disciple of a particular teacher, they sit at that teacher's feet and they learn from that teacher. And in general, the students that would go off to learn to be rabbis or go off to learn to read the law, to read the Talmud, and to read the Bible were men. And so it was very unusual for Mary to sit there at Jesus' feet while he was teaching. So there are these two different things going on. There's the hospitality and the expectation of hospitality, which is so strong and fundamental, that Mary is ignoring. And then there's her role as a woman sitting at the feet of the male rabbi master. And so Naveen Saras points out that this would have just been, even in her time, and I don't know, I'm just guessing by her picture on the internet, right? I'm guessing that she's somewhere in her mid-30s, right? She's a young woman. So even in this time, that separation of genders into roles of who gets to study, the Talmud and those sorts of things, is strong in Palestinian culture, in Middle East culture. Those are the first two levels of things that are going on there that we can glean from this. And so we can see that when Martha comes in and complains that Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet, and Jesus responds, "Martha, Martha." Now, why do you suppose he repeats her name? I mean, one interpretation of that could be that it was a sign of acknowledgement, of familiarity, of kindness, right? Martha, Martha, right? She has chosen the better part. In other words, it's okay for this woman who has chosen to learn from Jesus, to accept the Word, the living Word, and to sit at the feet of the living Word. This is something that is okay. So there's that first thing that's happening there. But it's also clear that it seems clear to me that Jesus is inviting Martha into that. And so it's not a denial of the importance of hospitality by any means, but it's an invitation into the contemplation of the Word in the midst of hospitality. And so those are the first two levels of interpretation, and I feel pretty secure in presenting those to you. Now, I want to talk about a third level, and it's a bit of a stretch, okay? And I don't know if I can make a case for it, but I think there's something there, and I'm hoping that we can find a way of at least learning from this. So, when Martha comes into the room and sees Mary sitting there, she's offended that Mary isn't helping her. She's probably at least a little bit confused that Mary is presuming to sit at the feet of the teacher. And I wonder if Martha can't imagine herself as a woman, as the host of this house, right? She can't imagine herself sitting there, because there's so much that needs to be done. And so in that moment of wondering, I wonder if what is happening here is that Martha can't imagine herself doing what Mary is doing. She can't imagine herself sitting at the teacher's feet. She can't imagine herself putting aside her busyness to learn from Jesus. And that leads me to wonder, what is it that we can't imagine for ourselves? What might God be calling you to? What might God be calling you into that you can't quite imagine? It might be right in front of you, just as Mary was right in front of Martha, and you won't even see it. I know that that's been true for me. It reminds me, I think there's a connection back to last week in the parable of the Good Samaritan. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, a scholar of the law of Moses asks Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" And instead of defining who qualifies as neighbor, Jesus tells a story that calls us to be neighborly, to be loving and compassionate and generous, to be what we would hope a neighbor would be to us. All right? And so in that sort of turning the question around, it opens up our imagination to what neighborly relationships are about. Are they about judging the other? Or are they about offering ourselves in love? And I think there's something like that going on here in this episode with Martha and Mary. Martha can't imagine herself sitting at Jesus' feet. She can't imagine that it's okay for for Mary to sit at Jesus' feet. And what is it that we can't imagine for ourselves that God might be calling us to? On my way into the church this morning, I passed 45th. There's a house with a relatively new-looking fence, and they have plastered at least 6 Black Lives Matter banners or posters on the outside of their fence. So as you drive by, that's what you see. Black Lives Matter. And I think about this question of what is it that we can't imagine? What is it that we can't imagine for someone else or for ourselves as it relates to the racial divisiveness that we've experienced over the last decade in our country? The people who started that Black Lives Matter movement surely know that all lives matter. But what they're calling us to see, which is hard, it's hard to see, it's a hard one, is that in this world, in our culture, we behave as though some lives matter less. And then there's similar issues around human sexuality, the LGBTQ fights that are happening in this church, in this denomination, and in others. At this very moment, we have the United Methodist Church split over questions of human sexuality because they can't see somehow, they can't see that it could be okay for someone who's different to sit at Jesus' feet and to learn from Christ. So what is it that we can't see? What is it that we're missing? What is it that we don't see when we look at someone else? And what is it that we don't see that God might be calling us to? Like Jesus called Martha. Martha, Martha. I'd like to think that he said, take a load off. Give yourself a break. Sit down for a minute. This is lovely. You've done enough for now. Let's talk. I know that's not in the story, and I'm making that up. I'm adding that to it. But that's what my imagination, that's what my heart would like to see happening next there. Because God is calling us beyond ourselves. Just as we were called last week in the parable of the Good Samaritan to be transformed from one who judges to one who seeks to be neighborly. This week we are called to be transformed and to learn to see with new eyes, and to learn to imagine what's possible for someone else, who they might be in God's eyes, and what's possible for ourselves, and who we might be called to be in God's eyes.